This video recording is part 2 of 2 for fluid, electrolyte, and acid-base balance. Our body is able to regulate acid-base balance and regulate the concentration of hydrogen ions by using 3 different mechanisms in a specific sequence. First, we have chemical buffer systems. Those are chemicals which can either soak up excess hydrogen ions or release bicarbonate ions to balance pH within our body. The second mechanism that will kick in is our brainstem respiratory centers, which will act within 1 to 3 minutes. And then finally, we have renal mechanisms, which are the most potent form of regulating pH within the body, but those require hours to sometimes days to affect changes in pH. And remember that strong acids will completely dissociate in water, and those can dramatically affect pH. Weak acids dissociate partially in water, and those are efficient in preventing changes in pH. Strong bases dissociate easily in water to quickly tie up free hydrogen ions because they can soak them up. And then weak bases will accept free hydrogen ions more slowly. Let's look at the first mechanism. You'll notice I had to change offices because where I was, it was too noisy. The first mechanism that we're going to discuss is the mechanism that includes chemical buffers. Chemical buffers are a system of one or more compounds that work to resist changes in pH when a strong acid or a strong base is added. They can bind to free hydrogen ions if pH drops or release free hydrogen ions if pH rises. We have 3 majoring chemical buffer systems that include the bicarbonate buffer system, the phosphate buffer system, proteins can act as a buffer system, and of note, alkaline water and food that are ingested and comprise a person's diet do not change the pH of body fluids or offer any health benefits. So the high pH water that everybody buys is a waste of money. Somebody's getting rich, but somebody's losing money. If we look at this particular slide, you'll notice that buffer systems can be found in intracellular fluid. So within the cells, we have the phosphate buffer system. We also have protein buffer systems, including amino acids that act as buffers, and those are found in all proteins. And hemoglobin acts as a buffer system for erythrocytes only. So those would be found in the cytoplasm of cells. In terms of extracellular fluid, we have chemical buffer systems including proteins that, again, amino acids can buffer and help with changes in pH. We also have carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer systems in extracellular fluid. We have plasma proteins that can act as buffers. So again, chemical buffers can either soak up or release free hydrogen ions. Let's take a closer look at the bicarbonate buffer system, which is a mixture of the weak acid carbonic acid and the conjugate salts, which in the body are usually in the form of sodium bicarbonate, which are weak bases. And this buffer system, again, is found in both intracellular and extracellular fluid. If a strong acid is added, then the bicarbonate ions can soak up or tie up free hydrogen ions, forming carbonic acid. And when pH decreases even just slightly, then the bicarbonate ions will help soak up the free hydrogen ions to form carbonic acid, unless all available bicarbonate ions, which is what we refer to as the alkaline reserve, are used up. Bicarbonate ions are closely regulated by the kidneys. Conversely, if a strong base is added, that can cause carbonic acid to dissociate and donate a free hydrogen ion. So in this case, if pH rises only slightly, we get that strong base of sodium hydroxide being added to the weak acid, which is carbonic acid. And when you look at that chemical reaction, you'll notice that one of the hydrogen ions from the carbonic acid will dissociate and attach to the sodium hydroxide, and there's an exchange reaction that will occur because that one hydrogen ion joining sodium hydroxide will allow the hydroxyl group from sodium hydroxide to form water, and then the sodium will bond with the remaining carbonate forming sodium bicarbonate. And so we've got that limitless supply from carbon dioxide being released from cellular respiration. That gives us a very strong supply of carbonic acid that can be used in this whole bicarbonate buffer system. And remember that carbon dioxide can also be released by respiration. So that supply of carbonic acid and carbon dioxide is also going to be subject to respiratory controls. The action of bicarbonate buffer systems is nearly identical to phosphate buffer systems, except that the components of the sodium salts in the phosphate buffer systems are changed to dihydrogen phosphate, which is a weak acid, and monohydrogen phosphate, which is a weak base. Now, while the phosphate buffer system is relatively unimportant in terms of buffering plasma, this is a very effective buffer system that's used in the production of urine, as well as what we find utilized in intracellular fluids where phosphate concentrations are high. Again, it's the same thing if we have a strong acid interacting with the weak base. In this case, we have the weak base as disodium phosphate. That will produce a weak acid known as monosodium phosphate and salt. Conversely, strong bases can be converted to weak bases, where if sodium hydroxide is introduced, that's a strong base that can interact with sodium dihydrogen phosphate, which is a weak acid, to form the weak base, disodium phosphate, and water. Now, when we look at this particular slide, we see the plasma on the far left, and the middle column is where we have the tubular cell, and the tubular cell to the right of that we have the lumen of the tubule. So actually the far right is what's going to be excreted. So this is actually demonstrating in the lumen of the tubule how disodium phosphate can split apart and take on that excess hydrogen ion that was kicked out by the tubular cell. This is how we can get rid of hydrogen ions. So that hydrogen ion is excreted and will combine with that weak base. The monosodium phosphate is the weak base to form monosodium dihydrogen phosphate, which will be excreted. And so that's a way to get rid of those hydrogen ions, and again is something that we see effectively occurring in the tubules of the kidneys, and especially in the distal convoluted tubule. Now you'll notice that in the tubular cell we can actually take the bicarbonate ion And with the sodium, you'll notice how those are going to be reabsorbed by the bloodstream, so we can maintain that bicarbonate reserve. That's one of the things that the kidneys do. They help us maintain that bicarbonate reserve. Because proteins are made up of amino acids, and amino acids have a positively charged amino group and a negatively charged carboxyl group, protein molecules are amphoteric. That means they can function as either a weak acid or a weak base. When pH rises, organic acid or carboxyl groups can release free hydrogen ions to lower the pH. Conversely, when pH falls, amino groups can bind to free hydrogen ions or soak them up, and that can help to raise pH. Remember that hemoglobin functions as an intracellular buffer within an erythrocyte. Buffering by proteins actually accounts for 2/3 of the buffering power that occurs within our blood, and most of the buffering within cells. Here's a quick little summary of the chemical buffer systems. Remember that the bicarbonate buffer system is a mixture of carbonic acid, which is a weak acid, and the salts of bicarbonate, which is a weak base. It's the main extracellular buffer, but also operates in intracellular fluid. Phosphate buffer system, we've got salts of dihydrogen phosphate, which is a weak acid, and monohydrogen phosphate, which is a weak base, and that's important for buffering in urine and intracellular fluid. And then the protein buffer system, which again makes up 2/3 of the buffering power in our plasma and in our cells, includes some amino acid side chains that can act as weak acids, in other words, those carboxyl groups, or as weak bases, which would be the amino groups. And the most important intracellular fluid is the protein buffer system, and that's also true in blood plasma. Now that we've discussed chemical or metabolic buffer systems, next we're going to take a look at physiological buffer systems. The respiratory system and the renal system are physiological buffering systems because they use the body's function, physiology, to either raise or lower pH, depending on what needs to happen. Now, physiological buffer systems act much more slowly than chemical buffer systems, but they have more buffering power. The respiratory system is able to eliminate carbon dioxide, which is acidic. And there's a reversible equilibrium that occurs in our bloodstream, and that is when carbon dioxide and water interact, that can form carbonic acid, which can further dissociate into free hydrogen ions and bicarbonate. When carbon dioxide is unloaded from our body, that reaction tends to shift to the left, and hydrogen ions are incorporated into water. During the production of carbon dioxide, that reaction is going to shift towards the right of this equation, and those free hydrogen ions are going to be buffered by proteins. So if partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the blood rises, that's a condition that is caused by hypercapnia. It can activate medullary chemoreceptors, which will cause an increase in the respiratory rate as well as respiratory depth. With rising plasma levels of free hydrogen ions or acidosis, that will activate peripheral chemoreceptors that are found in the carotid and aortic bodies, and that will cause an increase in respiratory rate and depth. So notice how either that partial pressure of carbon dioxide rises, it will cause an increase in respiration rate and depth, as well as rising plasma levels of free hydrogen ions will cause an increased respiratory rate and depth. Respiratory regulation is responsible for controlling levels of carbon dioxide. If a person is breathing slowly, is it a respiratory issue if pH is abnormally high? Methinketh not. Renal regulation is responsible for controlling the levels of bicarbonate ions as well as the level of free hydrogen ions. Chemical buffers cannot get rid of excess acids or bases from the body. Our lungs are responsible for eliminating volatile carbonic acid by eliminating carbon dioxide. Our kidneys eliminate what we call non-volatile or fixed acids produced by cellular metabolism. So phosphoric acid, lactic acid, ketones, those are examples of non-volatile or fixed acids produced by cellular metabolism. And our kidneys can get rid of those acids to help prevent metabolic acidosis. Our kidneys also regulate blood levels of alkaline substances and can renew chemical buffers. So here we've got a picture of a person experiencing metabolic acidosis. And so he may be experiencing confusion and have an increase in drowsiness. His blood pressure is going to decrease. He may have too much potassium in the blood, hyperkalemia. Muscles may be twitching. Skin may be warm and red, have a flushed appearance. This person may experience things like nausea, vomiting, diarrhea. He may have a headache. And usually the causes of metabolic acidosis are due to the ability of the kidney having been decreased, so it cannot get rid of acid, nor can it conserve base. So that's usually the big cause of metabolic acidosis, is going to be something that's affecting the kidneys. Now, it could be diabetic ketoacidosis, where the body's just producing so many of those ketones. Could be renal failure, could be shock, where the kidneys aren't able to do their job because the body's in shock, or severe diarrhea. Now, just to understand severe diarrhea, there's going to be a flushing of bicarbonate if there's no regulation of chyme going from the stomach into the duodenum. And so there's going to be a huge flushing of bicarbonate enzymes because you've got too much chyme, acidic chyme, going from the stomach into the duodenum. And that's why severe diarrhea would cause that. And the person might also experience what are called cusmal respirations, and that's basically hyperventilation that is compensatory as the person's trying to get rid of acid by blowing off carbon dioxide. The kidneys are really important in regulating acid-base balance by adjusting the amount of bicarbonate blood by either conserving or reabsorbing bicarbonate or by generating new bicarbonate. They can also excrete bicarbonate if we've got too much. Remember that if bicarbonate is either produced or reabsorbed, it's the same thing as getting rid of one free hydrogen ion. Excreting one molecule of bicarbonate would be equivalent to gaining one free hydrogen ion in terms of how pH is measured. So renal regulation of acid-base balance depends on the kidney's ability to secrete or retain free hydrogen ions. To reabsorb bicarbonate, the kidney has to secrete free hydrogen ions. To excrete excess bicarbonate, the kidney must retain rather than secrete free hydrogen ions. So if pH in extracellular fluid rises, that means it's becoming more alkaline, what will the kidneys do with free hydrogen ions and bicarbonate? Well, if pH is rising in extracellular fluid, then that would mean that we would want to conserve free hydrogen ions. So we'd have to get rid of bicarbonate. If pH falls in extracellular fluid, in that case, then we're going to want to keep or conserve or regenerate more bicarbonate and excrete hydrogen ions. So in order to maintain the alkaline reserve that our body needs as its primary chemical buffer, the kidneys must replenish or reabsorb bicarbonate. It's really important for them to be able to do that. The metabolism of food generates a new hydrogen ion that has to be balanced by generating a new bicarbonate ion. And secreted hydrogen ions are also used to reclaim filtered bicarbonate ions. So it's not really excreted from the body, it's incorporated into a molecule of water, which can be reabsorbed. So the body has the same number of bicarbonate and hydrogen as it started out with no net gains. So there are two mechanisms in the proximal convoluted tubule, and type A intercalated cells are the ones that are going to generate a new bicarbonate ion by getting rid of a hydrogen ion. So it's a mechanism that occurs by way of excretion of a buffered free hydrogen ion and by way of excretion of NH4+, which is a molecule of ammonium. So let's first look at the excretion of a free hydrogen ion by way of buffered hydrogen. And the most important buffer in our urine is going to be by way of the phosphate buffer system. And here we've got a picture of the type A intercalated cells. In the center of this picture, the filtrate, that's potential urine, is to the left, and then the interstitial fluid and then the blood capillaries are to the right of those cells. So what happens is if we look in the very center of that type A intercalated cell in the collecting duct, you can see that water and carbon dioxide are going to combine with the help of an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase. They're going to combine to form carbonic acid. Carbonic acid then splits into a free hydrogen ion, which you see on the left below number 2 on the screen, and a bicarbonate ion to the right. And then if we follow that free hydrogen ion, you'll notice that it is going to be secreted into the filtrate by a hydrogen ion ATPase protein pump, in which case it will combine with the phosphate group to be excreted in the urine. And then you'll also notice that the bicarbonate, if you go back in the middle of the cell to the number 2, the bicarbonate ion is going to enter the peritubular capillary by way of an antiport carrier, which is going to pump out the bicarbonate. At the same time, it will pump in a chloride ion, and then the chloride ion will actually leak back out into the interstitial fluid. So we're generating new bicarbonate in this entire process, where initially water and carbon dioxide interacted to form carbonic acid, and we got the bicarbonate from that carbonic acid. In terms of getting rid of free hydrogen ions, the excretion of hydrogen by way of ammonium is actually a more important mechanism for excreting acid, and this involves the breakdown of the amino acid glutamine. When glutamine is in the proximal convoluted tubule cells, it will be broken down and oxidized, acidified into 2 molecules of ammonium and 2 molecules of bicarbonate. The ammonium, if you look at the left-hand side of the cell, you'll see the ammonium being pumped out into the filtrate for excretion as urine, and at the same time, sodium will be pumped in. We need to have an equal exchange of positively charged molecules or ions. So we've got positively charged ammonium going into the urine, and then positively charged sodium will be antiported in, and that's going to be an active transport process. Now on the right side of this proximal convoluted tubule cell, you'll follow the 2 bicarbonate molecules, and they will be symported out of that cell with sodium, because bicarbonate is negatively charged and sodium is positively charged. So that helps maintain the electrical balance of the cell when bicarbonate and sodium are both going to be symported into the peritubular capillary. So that's how we move bicarbonate into the blood. That's how we excrete ammonium in urine. And by getting bicarbonate into the blood, that helps replenish the reserve of bicarbonate in the bloodstream. We need to have an alkaline reserve in the bloodstream. Sometimes things go wrong, and all imbalances that occur with acid-base balance are classified either as respiratory or metabolic in nature. So respiratory acidosis and alkalosis can be caused by failure of the respiratory system to perform its pH balancing role. And the single most important indicator of respiratory acidosis or alkalosis is partial pressure of carbon dioxide. Metabolic acidosis and alkalosis is going to include all other abnormalities other than those caused by partial pressure of carbon dioxide levels in the blood. And this can be indicated either by abnormal hydrogen ions or abnormal bicarbonate levels. So if we look at the symptoms of acidosis, again, headache, sleepiness, confusion, loss of consciousness, coma. In terms of breathing, acidosis can cause shortness of breath, coughing, arrhythmias, increased heart rate, seizure, weakness, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea. If a person is experiencing alkalosis, then that person can also still be confused or lightheaded, may have stupor. That can also lead to coma, by the way. Alkalosis can lead to coma. Person may also have nausea and vomiting. The muscular system for alkalosis is more prolonged spasm or twitching. The person might experiencing tremors in his hands or numbness and tingling in the face, the hands, or the feet. When it comes specifically to respiratory acidosis or alkalosis, the most important indicator for adequate respiratory function is the measurement of partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the blood. It is normally measured between 35 and 45 millimeters of mercury. If partial pressure of carbon dioxide goes above 45 millimeters of mercury, that normally indicates respiratory acidosis, because remember, more carbon dioxide is acidic. So it is the most common cause of acid-base balance. It's usually due to a decrease in ventilation or gas exchange. Maybe that's occurring because of chronic bronchitis or cystic fibrosis or emphysema, pneumonia. Could be idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis where there's an impaired gas exchange or alveolar ventilation is impaired. It could also be due to paralyzed respiratory muscles or an injury to the chest or extreme obesity. It can also be due to an overdose of narcotics or barbiturates or brainstem injury where the respiratory centers are depressed, resulting in either hypoventilation or even sometimes respiratory arrest. And again, there's going to be an accumulation of carbon dioxide in the blood, and that will cause blood pH to fall. Respiratory acidosis, lower blood pH. Conversely, if partial pressure of carbon dioxide goes below 35 millimeters of mercury, now there's not enough, and now that individual will experience respiratory alkalosis. Usually the most common cause of respiratory alkalosis is a person hyperventilating, often when that individual is experiencing stress or pain, having a panic attack or anxiety. And it could be due to brain tumor or injury where there's damage to respiratory controls. But again, the most common cause of respiratory alkalosis is usually hyperventilation. This is just a simple illustration of respiratory acidosis, which is usually due to a problem with ventilation where the person's not getting enough oxygen, so that's hypoventilation, versus respiratory alkalosis, which is hyperventilation. And you can read all these little symptoms that occur with that. Remember that our respiratory system regulates the level of carbon dioxide in our bloodstream. However, metabolic acidosis and alkalosis are going to be caused by different things. So when we look at metabolic acidosis, remember that blood pH ranges between 7.35 and 7.45 on the pH scale. It's going to be more acidic in venous blood, that's the 7.35 measurement, and more alkaline in arterial blood, which measures sometimes as high as 7.45 on the pH scale. So if an individual presents with low levels of blood pH and low levels of bicarbonate molecules, that's metabolic acidosis, which could be caused by a bunch of things, including too much alcohol, which converts to acetic acid. It could be due to loss of bicarbonate from persistent diarrhea or an accumulation of acid like lactic acid from a lot of exercise or shock, or ketosis during a diabetic crisis or starvation can be caused by kidney failure as well. So when blood pH falls below 6.8, that can lead to depression of the central nervous system, which can lead to coma and death. Metabolic alkalosis, on the other hand, is much less common than metabolic acidosis. It is indicated by rising blood levels of pH and rising blood levels of bicarbonate. It can be caused by vomiting the acid contents of the stomach or by eating too many antacids. If an excessive base is ingested, that can also cause alkalosis. So if the pH of blood rises above 7.8, that can cause overexcitation of the nervous system, which can lead to muscle tetany, extreme nervousness. It can cause convulsions and death, often from respiratory arrest. In terms of respiratory compensation mechanisms, if acid-base imbalance is due to malfunction of one physiological buffer system, then the other system tries to compensate. For instance, the respiratory system will attempt to correct metabolic acid-base imbalances, and the kidneys will attempt to correct respiratory acid-base imbalances. In metabolic acidosis, the respiratory system will compensate by increasing the rate and depth of breathing to try and blow off more carbon dioxide. High levels of free hydrogen ions will often stimulate respiratory centers to achieve this. In metabolic alkalosis, the respiratory system will try to compensate by decreasing the rate and depth of breathing. Slow, shallow breathing will allow carbon dioxide to accumulate in the blood, thereby lowering pH. The kidneys can also use compensation mechanisms because they'll try to compensate for pH problems caused by the lungs by adjusting bicarbonate levels. In respiratory acidosis, the kidneys can reabsorb more bicarbonate, create new bicarbonate, and get rid of more free hydrogen ions. Hypoventilation causes elevated partial pressure of carbon dioxide. With respiratory acidosis with renal compensation, what we see is low blood pH, high partial pressure of carbon dioxide, that's the cause of the acidosis, and high levels of bicarbonate, which indicates that the kidneys are compensating for the respiratory acidosis. In respiratory alkalosis, the kidneys get rid of more bicarbonate, and respiratory alkalosis with renal compensation is going to be indicated by high blood levels of pH, low blood levels of partial pressure of carbon dioxide, and decreasing levels of bicarbonate as the kidneys compensate. So respiratory system cannot compensate for respiratory acidosis or alkalosis, and the renal system cannot compensate for acid-base imbalances caused by renal problems. So the systems can't compensate for themselves, essentially. They compensate one for the other. So if we look at this last slide, yay, for fluid electrolyte and acid-base balance, if we look at metabolic acidosis, the primary change is going to be a decrease in bicarbonate. Now, if you look on the far right, the effect on the pH is to decrease that, which if there's acidosis, yes, there's going to be a decrease in pH. But notice in the middle, the compensation for the lungs is to decrease the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, get rid of some of that acid by blowing it off through the respiratory system. Now, metabolic alkalosis, if there's a primary change of too much bicarbonate, then the effect on pH on the far right is that it will increase. How do the lungs compensate for the metabolic alkalosis? Well, we are going to increase partial pressure of carbon dioxide by slowing down the breathing and not blowing it off too quickly. With respiratory acidosis, the primary change is going to be an increase in carbon dioxide. Remember, carbon dioxide is acidic, so if there's an increase in carbon dioxide because there's not enough being blown off, there's hypoventilation, then that's going to cause blood pH to decrease. We see that on the far right. How is that compensated for? Well, we're going to get more bicarbonate from the kidneys. So remember, there were three things with kidneys. There was reabsorption of carbonate, production of carbonate, and excretion of free hydrogen ions. With respiratory alkalosis, the primary change is a decrease in blood levels of carbon dioxide, so we have a decrease in partial pressure of carbon dioxide. The effect on pH on the far right is that it's going to increase, and so the compensation that the kidneys will do is excreting some bicarbonate to help lower that pH. And that's the last slide for this chapter.